Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about something that really needs to be said, and most of the people out there who understand nutrition agree on this, including many friends of mine, guys like Alan Aragon, and the research on this is pretty much overwhelming, and that's this idea that humans store carbohydrates as body fat. And I think there's some problems with that, major problems with that. Keeping in mind, when we talk about this with de novo lipogenesis, people need to understand that there's very specific things that happen with that, and the general consensus of even the most recent studies, I'm talking within the last year, they're saying, but the de novo lipogenesis that occurs from carbs doesn't seem to actually store as body fat. Okay, if it stores as fat anywhere, it tends to only be in the liver, right? It tends to only be in the liver, which is an interesting caveat. It's not like it's spreading through the rest of your body when it does occur, okay? So the thing is, people have this idea that, insulin is somehow this extremely negative thing that causes you to store body fat. And what they're not understanding is that the only time that's really associated in humans is when you have a major metabolic problem, right? And I'm talking extreme insulin resistance, okay? That's not occurring for people who work out, right? If you get in and you train, you don't even have to train as hard as I train. You train even remotely hard, and you're not morbidly obese in terms of body fat, the odds of you being insulin resistant are pretty slim. So this is not really a topic that we're talking about. So when we're discussing this in the context of people who exercise, people who work out, again, we need to understand that this is not really occurring. Insulin is largely a positive thing for body composition. If you have been focused on building muscle, you have decent insulin response because you work out, okay? Insulin is not really going to contribute to gains in body fat. Again, from the amount you're getting from food, okay? Because the insulin responses tend to be larger. We're not talking about people who are using copious amounts of it. It's just not the case. If anything, it tends to drive all the anabolic functions, bring up metabolic rate, all these other things. It's not a negative thing. In fact, it should be viewed as a very positive thing. Very positive thing. And as far as the carbs themselves, we just don't store them. We store dietary fat. Now, people will say, but isn't the end result the same? Well, if you're eating a fairly high-fat diet, then yes, the end result is the same, because your body doesn't care where it gets the other calories. It's going to store the excess fat. And so that's the problem people have. They're like, well, if you're burning carbs, you're not burning fat. Right, but if you're overeating fat, you're going to burn fat and then store all the excess fat. Whereas if you're eating a lot of carbs and fat, you're just going to burn carbs and then store the fat. Right, so their point is valid there, and that applies to even people on keto diets. There are plenty of people on keto diets who have very, very high body fats who've been keto for 3, 4, 5 years without even carb ups. Because again, they're eating a very high fat, high calorie diet. Okay, well, what do you expect? The fat that we carry in our body fat is almost entirely from the fat that we eat. And we're talking 95+%. That is where we get it from. And if you look at the carbohydrate overfeeding studies, they don't find that you're storing body fat from it. They're only storing fat to any meaningful degree from the fat that they're eating in their diet. So I would argue that if your goal is to minimize fat gain, minimize your fat intake. Again, in the context of if we are gaining weight, meaning you're bulking, you're in a calorie surplus. Okay? That's our context, because you're not really going to store the carbs. And if you keep the fat really, really low, just enough for, health functions, essential fatty acids, things like that, sure, you're not going to store much body fat, even in a calorie surplus. But you'll still probably store some, depending on how much fat you're eating and how big the surplus is. But if you're trying to minimize it, okay, there's definitely truth to that. When you're in a calorie deficit, probably not as big of a deal in regards to that because we're in a deficit, so we're not storing a whole lot anyways, right? So this is where people will then come in and say, but I've eaten a higher fat diet and I still lost body fat. And it's like, well, of course, because you're in a calorie deficit, right? We're in a calorie deficit. We're not storing a whole lot of fat anyways, irrespective of what we're eating. That's just not the way that it works. It's not going to happen to, a really large, meaningful degree. Keeping in mind, we are always doing that, though, and that's a take-home here of why the other matters. Even in a calorie deficit, you're storing some fat every day. You're just burning more than you're storing, right? Always a thing to think about. Cells are always turning over energy in, energy out. You can be in a deficit and a surplus at different points through the day, and ultimately the net is what's going to matter. The net is what's going to matter. So I don't want people to think I'm saying, well, you're not storing any fat just because you're in a deficit. Well, of course you are. You're just, again, it's the total net effect. You're still burning through more of it than you're storing. Okay, so hopefully people understand that. Think of it this way: if you have a gas tank in a car that always has some trickle in and out going at all times, you're still putting some in. Okay. It's just that we're dealing with the energy in, energy out equation. But this is ultimately true. The epidemiology also shows us not just the lab studies. That's stuff from the metabolic ward. But then you look at the same thing and you look around the globe. Cultures that eat the lowest fat tend to have the least body fat. Okay. Cultures that are really, really rich in carbohydrate but fat is low. Lots of starchy carbs and things, white rice. They tend to have low obesity rates, and this should not come as a surprise. Shouldn't come as a surprise. Carbohydrates have better satiety. They're better geared towards body composition, right? And I think that's a take home to remember too, not just the epidemiology, but the same when you look at athletes. Most of the leanest, fittest athletes on earth eat very high carbohydrate diets. Again, no surprise. The energy is required to train. The energy is required to exercise. It becomes a necessity if you want to be optimal. Okay, really high carbohydrate diets are the way forward. And again, I'm not saying all carbs are the same. I'm not saying that doesn't matter. That's a very nuanced, complex topic. But it is the reality. Higher carb diets tend to be healthier. You tend to be leaner. They tend to be better for performance. All right, guys. But that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.